You have this nationwide polarization. What do you make of that, given your experience in legislative bodies before this current political moment?
The first thing I would say is this is not something that happened overnight. This has been happening over a long period of time. People, I think, have a sense that they want to blame the current president for the political atmosphere that we're in, but things were pretty toxic. I kind of take it back to the Tea Party movement, where really you saw maybe a more extreme faction of a political party exercise a lot of, and well within their rights to do that, but exercise a lot of clout, a lot of willingness to come to meetings and speak their mind. And so I think there was a sense we've got to react to this. And so it just has been, and when the president ran in 2016, he really exploited a lot of that organization began really what I would call the populist kind of uprising in both political parties. When people used to say in 2016, well, Bernie Sanders didn't make it through the Democratic primary, so I'm voting for Donald Trump. There's just a lot of pundits who said, well, that's crazy. And I'm like, no, it's not. The right and left populists have a lot in common in terms of messaging. They have different solutions for problems,
right,
but the identification of the problem is pretty similar. So I think we've been at this a long time. One of the trends that we're seeing now that I think is particularly, I wouldn't say dangerous, but certainly alarming is the gender polarization, especially among young people.
For sure. It certainly has been interesting because you kind of hear this term, the manosphere, where you have these podcasters and influencers that have also exploited the divisions in this country. And it's certainly going to be interesting how that plays into electoral politics, because certainly in 2024, those influencers played a large role in young people's perceptions of the election. And so how do you think we get out of this rut where people's main source of information is from unreliable sources and they're kind of in these echo chambers?
Well, I always say, show me a podcaster who says, let's try and all get along and come up with solutions. They don't.
Not a popular message.
Right. Well, and anger and fear and bias,
Sells.
Your confirmation bias is huge. And so when you look at how do you get out of it, I think, we're in some really difficult political economic times. And by that, I mean, if you look at the economy of this country, income and wealth disparity is not getting any better. Things aren't getting more affordable. I just saw an article in the Wall Street Journal, which I think should alarm the president, which is during his first term, real wages of people in the bottom third of the country actually grew. There was actually a growth in terms of their income. That's not true anymore. And so, when people say, well, I did better under Donald Trump, a lot of lower income people did do better under Donald Trump. That's not true for the second term. And so I think how you get out of it is you have to stop being lazy politicians. By that, I mean just appealing to your base and trying to get turnout. You have to do the hard work of keeping your base activated and energized, but motivating other people, whether either non-voters or people who reluctantly voted for the other side, to begin to examine your policies. And then, you have to deliver. You can't just say. There's a couple trends that I think are going to hit. Number one, student loans for young people, for even millennials. Those student loans are going to become due again. There's going to be more collection activities. I think that the small business person who has been relying on a labor force that includes undocumented laborers is in for a real shock. So I think there's a lot of kind of headwinds on the horizon, and the person who can the political party and the politician who can stay ahead of that curve and speak the truth and reality of what's happening in middle America and what's happening in people's lives is going to be the successful politician.
You bring up a very relevant point in this conversation, that economic hardship, it breeds resentment and anger. And there are obviously plenty of willing people to take that anger and resentment and use it toward their advantage. You saw before there was a willingness to hear out both sides and hear from particularly your party, the Democratic Democratic Party. I wonder what you make of middle America, middle class workers who have maybe shifted away from the Democratic Party because they maybe didn't feel that they had a place there or were represented in the policies.
I think they've been shifting for a long time. I mean, there was the so-called Reagan Democrats who were union workers, and the, in spite of the fact that the Democratic Party has always protected, your ability to contract in a union, that union leadership is still supportive, but union membership is not. And so, you have to sit back and you have to kind of analyze where you lost people. And a lot of people would point to cultural issues. I don't think. I mean, I've been on campuses. I would tell you, I don't think it's cultural issues that are necessarily driving this. I think it really is. It is. There doesn't seem to be a place for me. You have for a lot of years, and rightfully, the Democratic Party has been supportive of elevating people who haven't had a chance before to participate, and that has made people who are maybe, especially white males, feel like they can't compete, and I think that's, you have to pay attention to that grievance because it's real, and in many cases legitimate.
Three different political names come to mind when I think about the former Democratic U.S. senators that have lost re-election or have left the Senate and that seat has gone to a Republican. Obviously, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, Jon Tester, and yourself, who have all really represented those Democrats who are able to build trust, even in states that maybe don't lean towards the left. And so why is that presence of Democrats absent now in those seats? And what do you think has contributed to that?
We have a test case coming up, don't we, with Sherrod Brown getting back in. And
Right.
So we'll see. And honest to God, anyone who says he doesn't represent working people doesn't understand Sherrod Brown's passion. And so he's going to have to communicate a different message. He's going to be running in a year that the president's not at the top of the ballot. It will be a turnout race, and he's going to help, I think, in a real way refashion the working person, the Democratic working person message. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how he fashions that dialogue. Whether this is a permanent realignment, I honestly don't believe it's a permanent realignment.
And the Democratic Party definitely is diverse because you do have those who view themselves as more so progressives, and then you have moderates, and then you have more so centrist Democrats. Definitely, it's a big tent, and it's hard to unite everyone under the same message. So how does the party navigate those challenges? Because we're seeing it now where the second Trump administration has really proven to be a point of division among Democrats.
Well, I mean, I think when you don't have a head, right, you don't have a politician who will speak and then everybody will react to. Instead, there's a lot of things that are happening in that ecosphere, right, with different messages, and there's bound to be conflict. And I don't know that that's bad. I don't know. I mean, I think that when it starts with, this is what unites us, these are some things that we have different ideas on. I just did an interview on what's happening in DC. And one of the trends that I saw, Democrats, kind of like, well, look at the crime statistics. People are, this is a perception problem, not a real problem. And I said, quit saying that. I mean, that's like going to the doctor and saying, I think my heart feels weird. And they say, well, that's a perception problem. It's not a real problem. This is a real problem for the Democrats. And Trump has messed up on immigration. He's underwater on that. He's messed up on the economy. Of course, he went to law and order. He's got, those were the three pillars of his stool that got him elected. And of course, he went to law and order. And the Democrats need to acknowledge that people don't feel as safe in their home. They don't think that their communities are as safe. And talk about how they would address some of those concerns instead of saying, nothing to see here, move on. That is not a message that will work. That's like what they did with the border. Nothing to see here, move on. Well, or inflation. That is exactly what they did in those two circumstances. And they failed as a political party as a result.
And I do want to spend some time on that because how do you combat that? Because the president's message, you see, it really does sell to people that don't even consider themselves supporters of the president. When the president is saying, I'm going to tackle crime, obviously it can be difficult for Democrats to say, I'm against that. And so, what is the messaging that Democrats should approach this with? Because it can kind of be difficult to be in that predicament where the president is saying, I'm going to tackle crime, I'm going to secure our streets. To the average voter, that may seem like a pretty normal message, but obviously there's nuance to this.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think you have to talk about, yeah, number one, acknowledge problem. One of the things that I've been saying is the president's response to this is all showmanship and no leadership. And if I were a Democratic mayor, I would be convening a group, calling the media, talking about what they've been doing that's working for homelessness, what they're doing that's working, and just really demonstrate an alternative. And then I would say, so we're going to deploy the National Guard in every city, and they're just going to walk the streets from now until eternity. Number one, there isn't an emergency. I mean, but there is a problem. And so I think you have to demonstrate a more rational response to all of this. It's what Bill Clinton did with the crime bill. Now, the crime bill, is controversial in the Democratic Party because it led to a lot of incarceration of African Americans, disparate treatment. Doesn't mean that it wasn't something that addressed a concern at the time. And so, to me, you need a crime bill 2.0 that recognizes the mistakes of the last crime bill, but it actually addresses concerns that people have about what's happening in our inner cities. You follow it up with, what are we going to do for housing? What are we going to do for student costs? The other thing that's going to hit here is the capping on student loans. And so a lot of, if you're wealthy and want to go to Harvard, I guess you don't have to worry about it. But if you get into Harvard, but you don't get a scholarship, I guess you don't get to go, because there's no way those caps will give you an opportunity to go to Harvard.
And that's the authenticity component of this, because people want to hear from politicians about the issues that impact them. And they want to have people that really represent their struggle and understand that struggle. In terms of Democrats' authenticity, that was something that we see very interestingly play out in New York City during this mayoral race that really kind of threw everything in the air. It really disrupted the status quo in a way where you had an established Democrat, former Governor Andrew Cuomo, who was running for mayor, but you have someone like Zoran Mamdani, who has really captivated Democratic voters in New York City. How do you think Democrats can really seize on authenticity? Because maybe that's something that was missing before.
I think honestly, the first thing that you can't fall into the trap of letting one Democratic candidate, who incidentally is not a Democratic candidate, even though they ran in the Democratic primary.
And also in a city that is heavily Democratic, that may not be representative of the country as a whole.
Right. And so when people ask me, well, what do you think about it? I said, I don't think about it at all. I think that if the city of New York elects someone, they're going to have to deal with it. It's not my problem. He doesn't represent me. His attitude and belief system is not my attitude and belief system. Simply because he identifies as a Democrat doesn't mean that he's a Democrat that I identify with. And so, I mean, but I think that what every Democrat should take from this is that he's tapped into a frustration and willing to come up with radical solutions that not a lot of people are willing to talk about. And so I also think that he has energized the youth vote. He wouldn't have gotten elected if people, Gen Z hadn't recruited all their friends to go register and vote for him. But you also, the other lesson is quit running old guys. Quit running people who have been around the block. If you're moderate, find a new, young, moderate voice to speak for your attitude and your belief. Quit running old people. I think that's the other message of this, which is people don't think that the old guard has done particularly well in delivering on the promise of a better life, and so you're just going to rehash and kind of regurgitate the same people who people don't trust. It's not going to work. So when you say that the establishment candidate, you could make an argument that the establishment candidate was pretty flawed, and that's what got. I mean, you ended up with the Eric Adams as a moderate alternative, and he didn't pan out all that well. So if you're in New York and you say, oh, you should be electing someone like that, only not flawed, it's complicated to voters.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. We have in this moment that generational divide play out in how Democrats should be responding to the Trump administration's actions, because you have one faction of the party that does represent that more so establishment part that is writing strongly worded letters and speaking out. But then you also have the other faction of the party that is calling to basically shut everything down and disrupt. What should be the response? Because certainly there are Democratic voters who are displeased with how their party is acting in this moment.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's up for leadership to decide what they're going to do. Obviously, Leader Schumer got incredible backlash. I think that had more to do with the coming out of nowhere, that decision coming out of nowhere, as opposed to that decision being the right or wrong decision. And so, again, the problem that the Democrats have is they think if they make one floor speech and explain it, that they've communicated to the Democrats why they're doing what they're doing. There isn't a cohesive and consistent message on what's going to happen. And now we're coming up to the end of September and we still don't see it. And so, there should be preparation right now. There should be a list of demands that the Democrats have. I mean, this is my suggestion. You should have a list of demands that the Democrats have for this go around, lay down the marker, and kind of explain what it's going to take to get enough Democrats to keep government open and begin that negotiation. And when the Republicans' position is take it or leave it, you're in a much better position to argue to the people that they're in charge, that they have a responsibility to cut the deal, and they aren't coming to the table.
Would you say the establishment is more so fearing that they'll lose those independent voters and taking on a message that is directly juxtaposed to the Trump administration? Is that what you think could be the case here, that those Democrats just don't want to be viewed as far left?
No, I don't. I think that instead of being viewed as far left, far right, they're viewed as fleckless and incapable of providing an effective opposition. And so whether it's left or center, I mean, I don't think people are, in fact, I know a lot of very, very liberal Democrats who are willing to swallow very hard on, some of their ideas. But again, a lot of it is, look, what you've been doing, running to the middle, your policies, which are a little bit of this, a little bit of that, have not been particularly persuasive to the body electorate. And so to me, this is really about being effective in opposition. And I think Democrats think that the Democratic rank and file think that the Democrats have not been effective in opposition.
Does it seem to you like running to the center in this day and age now is just running to the right, really, for Democrats?
No, I mean, I don't know. There's people who, like me, who are centrist, who, recently someone accused me when I was on television of being a communist. I said, I'm about as far as you can believe from a communist. I mean, that's not who I am. I am a capitalist, but you've got to acknowledge that capitalism has led to pollution. It has led to, unbridled and unregulated capitalism is not my philosophy. And so, you've got to moderate and be ready on, to let the free market work, and the free market will work for people. It builds jobs. I mean, I mean, I don't think that I necessarily, I don't think that Democrats right now are seeing left, center, or otherwise. I think they're just seeing incompetence. I mean, by that, I mean the Democratic base.
And lastly here, I just want to touch on something that's coming up. Obviously, midterms are in the near term, but there's also 2028, and we're already having that conversation now about that upcoming Democratic primary. There certainly are some Democrats who are in this moment trying to make a name for themselves. You have Governor Gavin Newsom of California, who had this big redistricting announcement in response to Texas's effort. You have governors like Wes Moore, who have really started to kind of build a name for themselves as well in Democratic media. What do you make of their efforts thus far? And would you say that they're appealing to the right audience and have the right message?
I think that the worst thing that happened is not having a competitive primary for us. Kamala could have made it through the competitive primary, but it wasn't a time. There wasn't time to help define to create kind of a dialogue. And so I think the fact that people are out there, they're expressing their opinions, they're talking about this, talking about what kind of leader they'd be. I think it's all good. I just think that competition builds better candidates. And, one of the things that I have said for years is when we nominate people who've never been in a political fight, that's not good for us. And so you take a Claire McCaskill or a John Tester, they know how to walk into a room full of people who don't like them and have a conversation. And, getting back to a point I made earlier, which is politicians have gotten lazy. By that, I mean, they don't want to go where people don't like them. They don't want to work that hard to persuade people. They don't want to spend the time that it takes to shake the hands and walk in the parades and do the things that need to be done to build relationships in places where you don't have relationships. And until you, and so these are not lazy politicians, the people that you have mentioned. And so they're willing to go out and do that work. So all is good. Competition, always good. Competition makes you better at almost anything that you do, as long as the competition is fair and not mean. And that's always, at what point do they turn on, they've got a big target in Donald Trump. So they don't need to turn on each other. They can say, yeah, that's one way of looking at it, but this is how I see it. You don't need to, it doesn't need to be, it doesn't need to be a circular firing squad. I think there's going to be plenty of time to talk about this. And the more people out there, examining politically and critiquing politically this president's message. I mean, I was disappointed yesterday because I heard a major political figure, given that, someone ran down a list of so-called Trump accomplishments, and he just went right back to message. Medicare, Medicaid, blah, blah, blah. And I want to say, no, you have to address, he said GDP is at 3%. That's not true. GDP for this year is under 2%. It's on average, it's less, and they're saying, look, full employment. I want to say, look at the trend line in employment. I mean, if I had been doing that interview, I would have paused and said, you know what? You're just, you got all the Republican talking points. I get it. But here's the response to what you just said about GDP. Here's the response to what you said about employment. Here's the response to what you said about wages. Here is the reality people are living in. And you keep talking about these macro numbers, keep talking about how it's doing better, and then look at the Michigan Index of Consumer Sentiment. Look at the business indexes that are telling you you've got trouble. So just keep doing that. It didn't work for George H.W. Bush when he did it, when he just kept responding to people's economic their economic angst by giving them macroeconomic numbers. It's just that's not their lived experience.
Yeah.
And so I mean, Democrats need to get out of talking point heaven and learn how to have a debate on economic numbers. And that is so frustrating to me.
That's something I think a lot of us have picked up on in just seeing what debates look like now versus what debates used to look like, because there certainly is more so a unification in the political argument now, where it's not as much about proving each other wrong, but as just getting your message out to as many people as you can before the other guy gets to them.
I tell you, people who are undecided who watch debates, that is one of the most frustrating things. If you've ever been with people like, okay, I'm done. I can't watch this anymore. All you're just repeating what over, and pundits do that. I mean, not pundits, but political consultants. And I think you just take all the political consultants, lock them up in a room, let them argue with each other, and then let people go out and be human beings and talk about why they're running, why they're concerned, what in these numbers concerns them, and get out there. Don't I just think that Donald Trump has been successful because he hasn't followed the traditional paradigm.
And it definitely is going to be difficult when you speak to legislation such as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, because a lot of Democrats, they zoned in on the Medicaid cuts. And a lot of those cuts don't go into effect until after the midterms. And so a lot of Democrats are sharing a message that isn't exactly applicable yet.
Yeah, but I will tell you, a lot of states are, this is going to get implemented by states. And so a lot of states are gearing up to basically implement work requirements, which have failed in a lot of different states that have tried them. And the other thing that's going to hit is, and you see it already, whether they're going to expand the Medicaid or the Obamacare increased subsidization on the exchange. Healthcare costs are going to be a huge issue in this midterm. My prediction is housing and healthcare. And the people who come up with an argument or, some kind of rational reason. And if you're Gavin Newsom, no place do you have an affordable housing crisis like you do in California. And so, but if I'm running against Gavin Newsom, I'd say, yeah, it works so well in your state, what you've been doing. You've had a lot of years to try and address this, and it's a problem that's unsolved. And so I think there's going to be as much as what you can say, well, they've delayed this, they've delayed that. The one thing about the big beautiful bill, and I argue this with my Republican friends, is most of that are benefits people already have. It's a continuation of the existing tax code and making permanent a lot of the various tax code provisions. And so people aren't going to see any real benefit either. So you can say, well, they're not going to see the cuts and the harm until after the election. They aren't going to see the benefit. And there is a really effective argument that these rates that have been made permanent greatly benefit rich people. So rich people did really well in that bill. I can tell you because I've looked.
And I'm sure, as you know, and voters know, it's always going to come down to pocketbook issues.
Yeah.